So first we're going to talk about a couple different international organizations. The first one we'll look at is the Arctic Council, and some of you may have heard of this one already. I think in earlier units we talked about it briefly. So the Arctic Council is an example of a regional international organization. So the use of the word regional means it doesn't apply to every single nation in the world, okay? It's specific to geographics, in our case, the Arctic, right? The high north. So the Arctic Council is founded in 1996 to monitor the effects of climate change and manage resources in the Arctic. Who's a member of the Arctic Council? So we have some major countries who are members, and then we have countries who are observers. The countries who are actual members include Canada, Denmark, the United States, Russia, Sweden, Finland, Norway, and Iceland. And you can kind of see what they have in common is that they're all Arctic nations, right? They all have a land claim to the Arctic. But we also have some observer nations, and on this little key on the image here, you can see that they're in a sort of paler blue and a green or yellow status. Those nations are several. We can see here on the map, obviously we can see China, India, many European states, Italy, okay, a little bit in South America. So they're mostly nations that have interest in the Arctic or have access to major waterways that lead to the Arctic. And to be a part of the Arctic Council, very little nationalism has to be sacrificed in order to participate. So being part of this organization doesn't require you to give up any sovereignty or autonomy. Next, we're going to look at the European Union. And we should have heard of this one before. So this was formed in 1993, and the European Union is the most well-known supranational organization. The EU is a regional organization as well, which focuses on economic cooperation. So regional in this case because you need to be in the continent of Europe. So all EU countries are in Europe. But to be a part of the EU, countries have to give up a lot of nationalism. Okay, they have to give up a lot of sovereignty. They have to follow EU member rules. They have to give up, in some cases, their currency. That's what makes it a supranational organization. Okay, so you have to give up a lot of national sovereignty to be a part of it. The EU, for the most part, has a common currency called the euro. Some countries don't have it, but for the most part, most EU countries follow the euro. Many organizations and countries and nations argue that the European Union exposes economically strong European countries to financial peril, while others argue the EU helps to ensure long-term peace. So there's two sort of arguments, and we can see recently with Brexit, okay, where Britain is leaving the European Union. And a lot of that argument has to do with they don't want to have to pay for poorer nations when they make financial errors. For example, we see a country like Greece hit economic issues, and countries like Britain, France, Germany, some of the wealthier nations have to bail them out or pay for them a lot of times. But on the other hand, since we see the creation of the European Union, we hardly have any more disturbances or wars in Europe. I mean, we've been looking in social studies at, two of the most major wars in the world having occurred in that area. And since we have EU, none of these things have happened. So there's positives and negatives to the European Union. Okay, so now we're going to talk about foreign policy a bit. Again, foreign policy refers to happening outside your own nation, right? The opposite of domestic, which is inside your nation. So how do countries set foreign policy? In countries ruled by dictators, absolute monarchs, or military junta, which is a group of military leaders, setting foreign policy is very easy, right? So if you have an absolute leader, basically the leader says, this is what we're doing, you need to listen to me, okay? But in other nations that have leaders who are elected or have to have sort of organizational approval, it's a little bit more complicated. For example, in democracies, setting foreign policy is a very complex process that must reflect the beliefs, values, and goals of a country's citizens. Individuals, groups, and collective influence government decisions on foreign policy. So one person doesn't make this decision. It's a lot of organization, it's a lot of bills and referendums and public policy. It takes a long time to set foreign policy. Setting these goals, though, can help people plan for future. It is important to set goals that reflect the values of a country's citizens, and clear foreign policy goals help guide the actions of government. Until the end of World War II, governments and diplomats were the main players in international affairs. But since then, the increasing pace of globalization has changed international politics and reduced the role played by nation states in international affairs. So, in modern times, we see countries playing less of a role in internationalism. And we're going to talk about some of the sort of organizations or groups that play a larger role today. So, how can you promote internationalism through foreign policy? The first is promoting peace. One of the most powerful ways states can use foreign policy is to promote internationalism by supporting initiatives that encourage world peace. In addition, countries sometimes try to promote peace by imposing economic sanctions on a state. Sanctions include cutting off trade with a country in effort to force it to follow a course of action. So, for example, in 1990, the United Nations imposed economic sanctions on Iraq. The goal was to force the dictator Saddam Hussein to cooperate with the UN, though some said they were actually designed to make life so uncomfortable for Iraqis that they would rebel and oust Saddam from power. So promoting peace can be sort of either saying, yes, we like what you're doing and encouraging it, or on the other hand, we see the economic sanctions and saying, if you don't stop doing that, we are going to cut off ties to you economically. And on our latest unit exam, we talked about South Africa, right, during apartheid, and countries like Canada put economic sanctions on South Africa to encourage them to change their policies on apartheid. Next, we're going to talk about peacekeeping. So in Canada, many Canadians are proud of their reputation for taking part in peacekeeping missions, and that a Canadian introduced peacekeeping to the world. So, a man named Lester B. Pearson, who would later become Prime Minister, was Canada's Minister of External Affairs in 1956, when an international dispute arose over control of a place called the Suez Canal. As the crisis brought the world to a brink of war, Pearson suggested that the United Nations ask countries that were not involved to contribute troops to an emergency force. This force would then keep the peace in the area while a solution was negotiated. The UN endorsed Pearson's proposal and the crisis was peacefully diffused. And this kind of set this sort of layout for peacekeeping efforts in the future. The United Nations will send outside forces to be there on site, but not to start wars, not to shoot on anyone, just to make sure that there's peace. This action, again, is a model for future UN peacekeeping missions in countries around the world. And Lester B. Pearson won an award for the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts. Peacekeepers, though, it should be clear, are not peacemakers, okay? They go to conflict zones only after there's been a ceasefire. So after both sides who are fighting have decided they're not going to shoot on each other. They go there to make sure that is maintained. Their role is to set up a buffer zone between the warring groups to observe and report on what happens. So they don't make them stop fighting. They go there to make sure that the fighting continues to stop after it's already happened. Peacekeepers help carry out agreements reached by the United Nations and governments, and they also protect people in humanitarian efforts such as providing food, shelter, and medical care. UN peacekeepers may provide some security, but they only use force in self-defense. And this is something we've talked about at length in this course so far. Peacekeepers, the United Nations, do not start wars. They do not get involved in wars. They only maintain peace. Troops involved in peacekeeping missions must adhere to the following guidelines. First is consent. They must respect the sovereignty of the host country. So the country has to give them permission to be there. Second is impartiality. Okay, they can't take sides. They're a neutral force. Okay, they have to be neutral. Then we have self-defense. They can use force only to defend themselves, not against any other side, just in defense. But many people question the role of peacekeepers. Most peacekeeping missions have been successful, but in the 1990s there were several failures. One of these occurred in the former Yugoslavia. In many cases, the peacekeepers were helpless to act because of their limited numbers, lack of military power, and orders to avoid using force. As a result, they're often effective in preventing genocide. So we see this in Yugoslavia as well as in Rwanda. Okay, so in 1994, again, they were unable to prevent genocide. And after the failing of the peacekeeping in Yugoslavia and Rwanda, many people said that the traditional ideas about peacekeeping needed to be abandoned in favor of active peacemaking, which we kind of see with NATO, which again we've talked about before. Okay, next we're going to look at international law. So in order to help resolve disputes arising from international conflicts, a body of international law was developed. It is based on international treaties, agreements, and conventions, UN resolutions, and widely accepted international practices. International law is interpreted by the UN's International Court of Justice, or the World Court. The World Court tries to settle international disputes peacefully, but some countries are reluctant to recognize its authority or abide by its decisions. So the World Court can make decisions, but sometimes there's not any enforcement to make a country or a nation follow that rule. Okay, so that's the issue with international law. All right, so now how much should a country set aside to help other countries? So foreign aid is a key component of humanitarian efforts of internationalism. Foreign aid is when a wealthy country, so if we looked again at sort of Maslow's hierarchy of need, a country that's kind of met that top section there, is able to set aside funds or money to be donated to the deeply impoverished countries or countries in a major crisis. So wealthy countries helping out poorer or countries in need. So how much does Canada currently spend? As of 2014, Canada spent $4.9 billion, which is about 0.24% of their gross national income. So that is income earned in the economy by the resident minus income made by non-residents. Okay, so this website here can give you a bit more detail on Canada's foreign aid spending, but it's about 0.24%. But again, if we look back to now Prime Minister Lester B. Pearson, he came up with something called the 0.7 solution. And again, Canada only spends 0.24%. But he said in 1969 that if wealthy countries contributed just 0.7% of their GNI to foreign aid, extreme poverty in the world would be greatly reduced. Despite many countries committing to this goal, virtually no progress has been made to actually reaching it, including in Canada. So this was a long time ago in 1969 that Lester B. Pearson said 0.7% would almost eliminate poverty, but wealthy nations still spend not near enough. Very small amounts in comparison to what's needed to be spent. All right, the last sort of definition we're going to look at is something called tied aid. So a lot of times countries will donate money to poorer nations as a form of foreign aid. But when we talk about tied aid, this is foreign aid that comes with conditions, okay, rules or expectations. So, for example, a recipient is forced to buy goods from the donor country or allow corporations from the donor country to operate in the recipient country. So, we're giving you a gift, but you need to buy from us or you need to let our international corporations move in, okay? We also might hear of something called the Marshall Plan. Some of you wrote your essays on this, and you talk a little bit more about this in Social 30. But basically, the idea here was back when the 1950s, after World War II, we see Truman as the President of the United States, and he offered a lot of countries in Europe money, foreign aid, to help them get out from underneath the disaster of World War II. But the expectation with this plan was that if they took the money, they would make steps towards becoming democratic nations, which at the time was important because we were right about to get into the Cold War, which was democracy versus communism. And with Marshall Plan, if a country took the American money, they were expected to become democratic nations. And it was a form of tied aid, right? Money with conditions. And the political cartoon we see over here is one looking at Russia. So we've got the bear, which is a symbol for Russia, okay, the bear. And at the top of the bear, we see a caricature or an image of Vladimir Putin, the current president of Russia. And in the bear's mouth, a present that says aid, okay, so foreign aid, perfect. And it's being gifted to the Ukraine. And all the people are saying, very generous of him, right? This is great. They're giving us foreign aid. But they say, on the other hand, but wait, what's the catch? And obviously, the foreign aid is in the mouth of the bear, right? So you could take the gift, but you risk getting bitten or stung, right? So that's an example of tied aid.